The most humiliating moment of my wife's life lasted less than 10 seconds, but it permanently changed the way I looked at my own son. My name is Harold Bennett. I'm 70 years old, and my wife Linda has been beside me since we were teenagers working at the same grocery store in Ohio. 50 years together. 50 years of building a family from absolutely nothing. We survived layoffs, debt, miscarriages, and the death of our first child before our son Matthew was born. Every scar in our marriage was earned honestly. Linda spent most of her life sacrificing quietly for our family. She skipped vacations so Matthew could attend private school. She wore the same winter coat for 12 years so we could help him through college without loans. She stayed awake during nights when I worked double shifts just to make sure our son never felt alone. She was the kind of mother who remembered every birthday, every allergy, every fear, every small detail people usually overlook when life gets difficult. And somehow, after all that, she ended up standing humiliated in the back row of her own son's wedding ceremony because of one sentence spoken by a woman who had only known our family for 3 years. Matthew's fiancée, Vanessa, always cared deeply about appearances. Even during their engagement, everything revolved around presentation, status, and image. The wedding wasn't treated like a marriage celebration. It was treated like a luxury production. Designer invitations, imported flowers, a 5-star venue overlooking the lake, professional social media coordinators. I'm not exaggerating. They literally hired people to manage online wedding content in real time. Linda didn't complain once, even though most of the decisions quietly pushed our side of the family further and further into the background. Vanessa's wealthy relatives controlled nearly everything. Front tables reserved for business partners, premium seating for investors, and important family connections. Meanwhile, Linda spent months helping with decorations, invitations, guest coordination, and even sewing small emergency repairs into bridesmaids' dresses because Vanessa kept changing designs at the last minute. Not once did Linda ask for recognition. That's just who she is. The wedding day arrived bright and warm, and for the first time in weeks, Linda seemed genuinely happy. She wore a soft blue dress she'd spent days choosing because she wanted to look elegant without drawing attention away from the bride. I remember watching her fix her hair in the mirror that morning and smiling nervously like she was preparing for an exam instead of attending her son's wedding. We arrived early at the ceremony hall before most guests. The front rows had reserved signs attached to every chair. Linda noticed there were no cards with our names. She looked confused, but assumed it was a mistake. Then Vanessa approached us with that polished smile she used whenever she wanted to sound kind while saying something cruel. "Oh, actually," she said lightly, "those seats are for real family." I genuinely thought I misunderstood her. Linda blinked slowly and asked, "I'm sorry." Vanessa adjusted her bracelet and laughed softly like the conversation was harmless. My parents wanted immediate family in front for photos and appearances. You know how these things are. Immediate family. Real family. As though the woman who carried Matthew for 9 months and raised him for 30 years had somehow become a background guest at her own son's wedding. Linda's face changed immediately. Not dramatic. Not angry. Just wounded in the quietest possible way. People think heartbreak always looks emotional, but sometimes it looks like silence. She nodded once and whispered, "Of course," then started walking toward the back rows before I could even respond. I looked at Matthew, standing near the altar hoping, praying he'd stop this insanity. Instead, he looked away. That moment hurt more than Vanessa's words because betrayal always cuts deeper when it comes wrapped in cowardice. I followed Linda to the back where she sat down carefully, pretending to adjust her purse so nobody would notice her wiping tears. My wife, the woman who built that boy's entire life, was hiding in the last rows like she'd done something shameful. I leaned toward her and quietly said, "We're leaving." But Linda shook her head immediately. "No," she whispered. "I won't ruin his day." That sentence almost broke me because even after being humiliated, her first instinct was still protecting our son. The ceremony began 10 minutes later. Music played. Guests smiled. Cameras flashed. And I sat there boiling with a kind of anger I hadn't felt in decades. Every wedding speech about family suddenly sounded fake. Every mention of love sounded hollow. Then halfway through the reception, the wedding coordinator approached me asking if I was still planning to give the scheduled father of the groom speech. Suddenly, I understood something important. They wanted my dignity hidden in the back row, but they still wanted my performance on stage. They still wanted the emotional speech, the proud father moment, the smiling family image for guests and cameras. That's when I made my decision. I stood up when my name was called and walked slowly toward the stage while the crowd applauded politely. Vanessa smiled with visible relief, probably assuming I'd play my assigned role quietly. Matthew looked nervous but hopeful. I took the microphone, looked across the ballroom, then looked directly at my wife sitting alone near the back beside strangers while the front tables overflowed with people who barely knew my son. And for a few seconds, I said nothing at all. Silence makes people uncomfortable because it forces them to think. Then I finally spoke. Before I say anything else tonight, I said calmly, I'd like everyone to notice where my wife is sitting. The room immediately shifted. Conversation stopped. Linda looked horrified. Vanessa's smile disappeared instantly. I continued anyway. That woman sitting in the back row spent 30 years sacrificing for the man standing beside the bride tonight. She worked night shifts, skipped meals, sold jewelry, and gave up dreams so our son could have opportunities we never had. You could feel tension spreading through the ballroom like smoke. Matthew stared at the floor. Vanessa looked frozen. But earlier today, I continued. She was informed that the front seats were reserved for real family. Gasps rippled across the room immediately. Vanessa's mother turned pale. Several guests started whispering aggressively. Linda shook her head softly, silently begging me to stop. But after 50 years of watching her protect everyone else's feelings, I was done protecting people who humiliated her. I looked directly at Matthew, then, and asked a question publicly he'd avoided privately. Son, do you believe your mother is real family? The silence that followed felt endless. Matthew's face turned red. Vanessa reached for his arm desperately, but he pulled away slowly. Finally, with tears forming in his eyes, he stepped down from the stage and walked across the ballroom toward the back row where Linda sat trembling. Then, in front of 200 guests, he knelt beside her chair and said words I think he should have said hours earlier. Mom, I'm so sorry. Linda immediately started crying. Not loud, dramatic crying. The kind people do when they've held pain inside too long. Matthew helped her stand, then walked her personally to the front row while the entire ballroom watched in complete silence. Some guests even started clapping softly. Vanessa remained frozen near the sweetheart table, looking absolutely stunned that image management had collapsed so publicly. But I wasn't finished yet. I returned to the microphone one final time and said, a wedding built around appearances instead of respect will eventually expose exactly what matters most to the people involved. Tonight wasn't supposed to teach that lesson publicly, but maybe it needed to. Then I stepped down from the stage and sat beside my wife in the front row where she belonged from the beginning. The rest of the evening felt completely different after that. Guests treated Linda warmly. Several older relatives approached her apologizing for not speaking up earlier. Vanessa barely spoke the rest of the night, and Matthew stayed close to his mother for nearly the entire reception like a man, finally realizing how easily good people can be taken for granted when stronger personalities control the room. 3 months later, my son visited our house alone. He admitted the marriage was already struggling because Vanessa cared more about status than loyalty. He told me the speech forced him to confront things he'd ignored during the engagement. Mainly how often he stayed silent to avoid conflict, even when silence hurt the people who loved him most. I told him adulthood begins the moment you stop confusing peacekeeping with cowardice. Linda, of course, forgave him almost immediately because mothers often forgive before apologies are even complete. But I never forgot that day, not because of the insult itself, but because it revealed something dangerous about modern relationships. Too many people now treat family like branding. They value appearance over sacrifice, presentation over loyalty, status over gratitude. But eventually life exposes those priorities publicly. And when that happens, No amount of expensive flowers,